The Florida sun was beating down mercilessly as we stood around my husband's gravesite, but nothing could have prepared me for the chill I felt when I heard Carol whisper behind me, "Finally, it's all mine." I turned to see my sister-in-law smirking as they lowered Frank's casket into the ground. What she didn't know was that in exactly 1 hour, attorney David Chen would be reading not one, but 2 wills, and the second one was going to destroy everything she thought she knew about her brother's final wishes. I'm Linda Andrew, and I'm 52 years old. I've been teaching 3rd grade at Sunset Elementary here in Miami for the past 18 years. 3 weeks ago, I lost my husband Frank Hayes in a sudden heart attack. He was 58 and owned Hayes and Rodriguez Restaurant Group, a chain of 12 successful Cuban restaurants throughout South Florida. For the past 8 years of our marriage, I thought I understood our family dynamics, but I was about to learn that Frank had been keeping secrets that would change everything. Standing beside me that humid Tuesday morning was Sophie Hayes, Frank's 2-year-old daughter from his first marriage, who was home from the University of Florida for the funeral. Behind us were Frank's business partner Tony Rodriguez, who's 54 and had built the restaurant empire with Frank over 20 years, and Frank's elderly mother Eleanor Hayes, who's 78 and had been the backbone of our family since Frank's father died. But the person who would make this day unforgettable was Carol Hayes, Frank's 9-year-old sister who had never worked a day in her life but lived like she was wealthy thanks to Frank's generosity. Carol was married to Mark Thompson, a 2-year-old insurance salesman whose career had been struggling for years. For the past decade, Carol had been dropping hints about Frank's will, assuming she'd inherit enough money to maintain her lavish lifestyle forever. To understand what happened that day, you need to know about the complicated relationship between Frank and his family, especially his sister Carol. Frank had built his restaurant business from nothing, starting with a small cafe in Little Havana and growing it into a multi-million-dollar operation. He was generous to a fault, always helping family members who struggled financially, but he also believed strongly in hard work and personal responsibility. Carol had been the opposite of Frank in every way. Where he worked 16-hour days building his business, she spent her time shopping, going to spas, and attending charity lunches where she could network with Miami's wealthy social circles. She'd never held a real job, having married Mark straight out of college, and then spending 30 years living beyond their means while expecting Frank to cover the difference. Frank had been supporting Carol and Mark for over a decade, paying their mortgage when Mark's insurance sales fell short, covering Sophie's college expenses when Carol claimed they couldn't afford it, and even funding Carol's expensive shopping habits when she had emergency needs. What bothered Frank most wasn't the money he had plenty, but Carol's attitude of entitlement and her complete lack of appreciation for his sacrifices. Our marriage had been Frank's second chance at happiness. His first wife, Sophie's mother, had died of cancer when Sophie was just 8 years old. Frank had spent 6 years as a single father, building his business while raising his daughter, before we met at a school fundraiser where I was volunteering and he was one of the major donors. Our relationship had been built on mutual respect and shared values. Frank admired my dedication to teaching, even though it meant I'd never be wealthy, and I loved his work ethic and his commitment to providing authentic Cuban cuisine to Miami's diverse community. We'd married in a small ceremony 8 years ago, and Frank had officially adopted my teaching career as his own cause, donating generously to educational programs throughout the district. What I hadn't realized until after Frank's death was how much his family's financial dependence had been bothering him. I'd known he helped Carol and Mark, but I'd assumed it was occasional assistance between siblings. The truth was that Frank had been essentially supporting their entire lifestyle, paying not just for emergencies, but for their daily living expenses, while Carol refused to get a job. 3 months before his death, Frank had made a comment that should have been a warning sign. We were having dinner at one of our restaurants when he said, "Linda, I need to make some changes to my business arrangements. Some people in this family need to learn what it means to stand on their own 2 feet." At the time, I thought he was talking about maybe reducing his financial support for Carol and Mark, encouraging them to become more independent. I had no idea that Frank had been working with his longtime attorney David Chen to completely restructure his estate plans. Frank had been quietly documenting Carol's financial demands, Mark's failed business ventures, and their complete lack of effort to improve their situation. More importantly, he'd been making secret arrangements to ensure that his death wouldn't become a windfall for people who'd never appreciated his hard work. The week before Frank's heart attack, he'd had a long conversation with Sophie about responsibility and the importance of earning what you receive in life. Sophie later told me that her father had seemed unusually focused on legacy and making sure his values would continue after he was gone. She thought he was just being philosophical, but now I understand he was preparing her for what was about to happen. Frank's funeral was held at St. Teresa Catholic Church in Coral Gables, where we'd been married and where he'd been a generous supporter for years. The service was beautiful, with hundreds of people attending to pay their respects to a man who'd touched many lives through his business success and community involvement. But even during the service, I could sense tension among family members about what would happen to Frank's estate. Carol had spent the entire week before the funeral making comments about how Frank would have wanted his family taken care of, how his death meant she'd finally be able to live without financial stress, and how generous Frank had always been to those he loved. She'd even started making plans for redecorating her house and buying a new car, apparently confident that her inheritance would cover these expenses. The first sign that Carol's assumptions might be wrong came during the reading of Frank's will, which was scheduled for immediately after the burial. David Chen had reserved a conference room at his law office, and everyone expected a straightforward reading that would confirm what Carol believed, that Frank's wealth would be distributed among his immediate family members. We gathered in David's elegantly appointed conference room overlooking Biscayne Bay, with Carol sitting at the head of the table like she was already in charge of Frank's estate. Sophie sat beside me, still grieving her father's loss, while Tony and Eleanor took seats across from us. Mark hovered near Carol, clearly as anxious as she was about their financial future. David began by expressing his condolences and explaining the legal procedures for estate distribution. Then he opened a folder containing what appeared to be Frank's last will and testament, dated 6 months earlier. This document was signed by Frank in my presence and witnessed by 2 members of my staff, David explained. I'll now read the terms of his bequest. What followed was shocking, but not in the way Carol expected. Frank had left his restaurants and business assets to Tony Rodriguez, his longtime partner who'd helped build the empire. He'd established a substantial trust fund for Sophie's education and future needs. He'd left our home and a generous financial settlement to me. But for Carol, there was only a modest inheritance of $50,000, with a note that said, I hope this will encourage you to finally become self-sufficient. The silence in the room was deafening. Carol's face had gone completely white, and Mark looked like he might faint. This wasn't the multi-million-dollar inheritance they'd been counting on. It was barely enough to cover their existing debts. There must be some mistake, Carol said, her voice shaking. Frank always promised he'd take care of me. $50,000 isn't enough to. I have expenses, obligations. I understand your disappointment, David said diplomatically, but these were your brother's wishes, as expressed in his legal will. That's when Carol's composure completely collapsed. This is ridiculous, she screamed, standing up so abruptly that her chair fell backward. Frank owed me more than this. I'm his sister. I've been counting on this money. Sophie looked mortified by her aunt's behavior, while Eleanor shook her head sadly. Tony seemed uncomfortable, but not surprised. Apparently Frank had discussed some of these decisions with his business partner. Carol, I said gently, Frank loved you, but he also believed in— Don't you dare tell me what my brother believed, Carol interrupted furiously. You were only married to him for 8 years. I've been his sister his whole life. That's when she made the accusation that changed everything. You manipulated him, Carol said, pointing her finger at me. You convinced him to cut me out of his will because you were jealous of our relationship. The accusation was so unfair and hurtful that I started to cry. Frank and I had never discussed his will in detail, and I'd certainly never suggested he reduce Carol's inheritance. In fact, I'd often encouraged Frank to be patient with her financial struggles. David was about to respond to Carol's outburst when his assistant knocked on the conference room door. "Mr. Chen," she said quietly, "there's something you need to see. We found another document in Mr. Hayes's safe deposit box." The expression on David's face told me that whatever his assistant had found was significant. "Excuse me for a moment," he said, stepping out of the room with his assistant. During the 5 minutes he was gone, Carol continued her tirade about being cheated out of her rightful inheritance, while Mark tried unsuccessfully to calm her down. Sophie was crying, overwhelmed by her aunt's greed and anger on what was supposed to be a day for mourning her father. When David returned, he was carrying another folder and wearing an expression I couldn't quite read. "I need to inform you all that we've discovered a second will," he announced. "This document is more recent than the first, dated just 2 weeks before Frank's death." The room fell completely silent. Carol's face showed a mixture of hope and suspicion. Maybe this second will would give her what she felt she deserved. "According to Florida law," David continued, "the most recent will supersedes any previous versions. I'll now read the terms of Frank's final wishes." What David read from that second will was unlike anything anyone in that room could have imagined. Frank had completely restructured his estate in ways that showed he'd been planning much more than a simple inheritance distribution. "I, Frank Hayes," David began reading, "being of sound mind and body, do hereby revoke all previous wills and declare this to be my final testament. After much consideration and observation of my family's behavior over the past year, I have decided that my wealth should be distributed based on merit, need, and character rather than blood relationship or expectation." Carol leaned forward, clearly hoping this meant she'd receive a larger inheritance after all. But what came next destroyed any hope of that. "To my sister Carol Hayes Thompson I leave, the sum of $10,000, along with documentation of every financial contribution I have made to her household over the past decade, totaling $847,000. This money was given freely, but was intended to help her achieve independence, not to enable a lifestyle of permanent dependence." Carol gasped audibly. Not only was her inheritance smaller than in the first will, but Frank had been keeping detailed records of exactly how much he'd given her over the years. David continued reading, "Carol's portion of my estate is contingent upon her obtaining meaningful employment within 6 months of my death and maintaining that employment for at least 1 year. If she fails to meet this condition, her inheritance will be donated to literacy programs in Miami-Dade County." The shock on Carol's face was absolute. Frank had essentially challenged her to get her first real job at age 49, or lose even the small inheritance he'd left her. But Frank wasn't finished with his surprises. "To my beloved wife Linda, I leave our family home, $500,000 in cash, and full ownership of the Hayes Educational Foundation, which I have established with an initial endowment of $2 million to support teachers and educational programs throughout South Florida." I nearly fell out of my chair. Frank had created a foundation in my honor without telling me, using a significant portion of his wealth to support the cause I dedicated my life to. The reading continued with generous provisions for Sophie, including full ownership of 3 of the restaurants and enough money to pursue any career she chose without financial pressure. Tony received the remaining restaurants and the right to expand the business using funds Frank had set aside specifically for growth. But the most shocking revelation was still to come. Finally, David read, "I must address the matter of my sister Carol's recent attempts to manipulate my estate planning for her benefit." The room was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning humming. Carol looked like she'd been turned to stone. Over the past 3 months, Carol has made multiple attempts to influence my will through emotional manipulation, false claims about her financial situation, and even suggestions that my wife was trying to turn me against my family. I have documented evidence of these conversations, including recordings made with my attorney's advice. David looked up from the will to gauge the room's reaction. Carol's face had gone from white to red to purple, and Mark was staring at his wife like he'd never seen her before. Carol's behavior has convinced me that she views my death not as a loss to be mourned, but as an opportunity to be exploited. Therefore, I am including in this will a complete accounting of her manipulation attempts, along with my decision to significantly reduce her inheritance as a consequence of her actions. The final section of the will was Frank's message to his family. I hope that my decisions will encourage those I love to build their own meaningful lives rather than waiting for others to provide for them. Wealth should be earned through contribution, not inherited through expectation. The moment David finished reading the will, Carol exploded in a way that shocked everyone in the room. "This is fraud!" she screamed, standing up and sweeping papers off the conference table. "Frank was mentally ill. He was manipulated." "This will is fake, Carol," David said calmly. "I can assure you that both wills are completely legitimate. Your brother was of sound mind when he executed both documents." "Sound mind?" Carol laughed bitterly. "He left millions of dollars to a teacher instead of his own sister. That's not sound mind. That's insanity." Sophie finally spoke up, her voice quiet but firm. "Aunt Carol, Dad loved Linda, and he believed in her work." "Her work?" Carol spun around to face Sophie. "She's an elementary school teacher. She babysits children for a living. That's not worth millions of dollars." The insult to my profession hit me like a slap, but before I could respond, Eleanor Hayes spoke for the first time since the reading began. "Carol Elizabeth Hayes," she said in the voice that had commanded respect in the Hayes family for decades. "You will stop this immediately." "Mom," Carol said desperately, "you can't possibly support this. Frank has lost his mind." "Your brother," Eleanor said firmly, "was the smartest, most generous man I ever knew. If he made these decisions, he had good reasons." That's when David dropped the final bombshell. "Actually, Mrs. Hayes, Frank left a video message to be played after the will reading. Would you like me to show it now?" Carol looked like she might faint. A video message meant Frank would be speaking from beyond the grave, explaining his decisions in his own words. David set up a laptop computer and pressed play. Frank's familiar face appeared on the screen, and seeing him again so soon after his funeral was emotional for everyone in the room. "If you're watching this," Frank began, "it means I'm gone, and you've just heard the reading of my will. I know some of you, particularly Carol, are upset by my decisions, but I want to explain why I made the choices I did." Frank's image looked directly at the camera as if he could see into the conference room. "Carol, for 10 years I've been supporting your lifestyle while you made no effort to become self-sufficient. I gave you money every month, paid your mortgage, covered your expenses, and you never once thanked me or asked what you could do to help yourself." Carol was crying now, but they weren't tears of grief. They were tears of anger and frustration. "3 months ago," Frank continued, "you came to my office and told me that you'd heard Linda was trying to influence my will. You suggested that I should protect family interests by making sure my wife didn't inherit too much of my estate. That conversation was recorded, Carol, because my attorney had advised me to document any attempts to manipulate my estate planning." The room was dead silent, except for Carol's sobbing. Mark was staring at his wife with a mixture of horror and disgust, clearly learning about her manipulation attempts for the first time. "Linda has never asked me for anything," Frank said. "She's never even discussed my will with me. She married me when I was a widowed father with a struggling business, and she loved me and Sophie unconditionally. She deserves every penny I've left her, and she'll use it to help other people, which is more than I can say for some members of my family." Frank's message continued with personal words for Sophie. encouraging her to pursue her dreams, and for Tony, thanking him for years of partnership and friendship. But his final words were directed at Carol. "Sister, I hope this experience teaches you something about the difference between entitlement and gratitude. You have 6 months to find a job and start building a life based on your own efforts. If you succeed, you'll discover something I've known for years, that earning what you have is much more satisfying than being given what you want." As the video ended, Carol made one final, desperate attempt to salvage the situation. "This is all lies," she screamed. "Frank was brainwashed by that woman." She pointed at me with such venom that Sophie actually moved protectively closer to me. That's when Tony Rodriguez spoke up for the first time. "Carol," he said quietly, "Frank played me parts of those recorded conversations 3 months ago. He wasn't brainwashed. He was heartbroken that his own sister was trying to manipulate him." The truth hit Carol like a physical blow. Not only had her manipulation attempts failed, but other people knew about them. Her reputation in the family was destroyed, and her financial future depended on finding her first real job at age 49. David concluded the meeting by explaining the legal steps required to execute the will and the timeline for distributing assets. Carol would have 6 months to find employment, and her progress would be monitored by a trust administrator Frank had appointed. As we were leaving the conference room, Carol made one final, pathetic attempt to change my mind. "Linda," she said, grabbing my arm, "you could contest the will. You could share some of your inheritance with family." I looked at this woman who had spent years taking advantage of my husband's generosity, who had tried to manipulate him against me, and who had just insulted my life's work. "Carol," I said gently, "Frank's money is going to help thousands of children get better educations. That's exactly what he would have wanted." The months following Frank's will reading were transformative for everyone involved, but especially for Carol, who faced the reality of having to work for the first time in her adult life. The trust administrator Frank had appointed was thorough and unsympathetic, requiring documented proof of employment and regular progress reports. Carol's job search was initially unsuccessful, partly because she had no work experience and partly because her attitude remained entitled and demanding. She applied for management positions at retail stores, executive assistant roles at law firms, and other jobs that required skills she'd never developed. After dozens of rejections, she finally accepted a position as a receptionist at a dental office, earning $12 an hour. The adjustment was brutal for someone accustomed to spending money without earning it. Carol and Mark had to sell their house, downsize to a modest apartment, and give up the country club membership and luxury cars that had defined their social status. Mark, meanwhile, threw himself into his insurance business with new determination, apparently motivated by the realization that his wife's inheritance wasn't going to save them. Sophie used her inheritance wisely, keeping 2 of the restaurants she'd inherited while selling the third to fund her graduate education. She was studying business administration with a focus on sustainable food service, planning to expand the family business while maintaining its commitment to authentic Cuban cuisine and community involvement. Tony Rodriguez proved to be exactly the business leader Frank had believed he could be. Within 2 years of taking full control of the restaurant group, he'd opened 3 new locations and established a scholarship program for culinary students from low-income families. The business thrived under his leadership, validating Frank's decision to trust his longtime partner over his blood relatives. My own life changed dramatically as I took on the responsibility of managing the Hayes Educational Foundation. The $2 million endowment allowed us to fund teacher training programs, provide supplies for underfunded schools, and create mentorship opportunities for students interested in education careers. Working with the foundation became my full-time job, allowing me to impact education policy at a much larger scale than I ever could have as a classroom teacher. The most satisfying development was watching Carol slowly transform from an entitled, manipulative person into someone who finally understood the value of honest work. By the end of her first year of employment, she'd received 2 raises and a promotion to office manager. More importantly, she'd developed genuine friendships with her coworkers and seemed to take pride in her contributions to the dental practice. Carol's relationship with the family remained strained, but it gradually improved as she demonstrated real change in her character. She apologized to me 6 months after the will reading, acknowledging that her behavior had been unforgivable and thanking me for not blocking her inheritance entirely. "I never understood what Frank was trying to teach me," she admitted during one of our coffee meetings. "I thought family meant automatic support, but Frank was trying to show me that love sometimes means forcing people to stand on their own." Eleanor, Frank's mother, became one of the foundation's most enthusiastic supporters, attending our fundraising events and using her social connections to raise awareness about educational inequality in Miami. She often said that Frank's final gift wasn't the money he'd left, but the lessons he'd taught his family about earning what you receive and valuing what you have. 3 years after Frank's death, I attended Carol's wedding anniversary party, a modest celebration at a community center rather than the expensive venue they might have chosen before. Watching Carol laugh with friends from her job, seeing Mark's pride in his wife's transformation, and observing their genuine happiness despite their reduced circumstances, I finally understood the full scope of Frank's wisdom. Frank had given his sister exactly what she needed, even though it wasn't what she wanted. By forcing her to work, he'd given her self-respect, genuine relationships, and the satisfaction of earning her own way in the world. The tens of thousands of dollars he'd left her was less important than the opportunity he'd created for her to discover her own worth. The Hayes Educational Foundation continued to grow, eventually expanding beyond Florida to support education programs in other states. We created teacher fellowships, funded innovative classroom projects, and provided college scholarships for students pursuing education careers. Every program we funded carried Frank's name and reflected his belief that investing in education was investing in society's future. 5 years after that shocking will reading, I stood before a crowd of teachers, students, and education advocates at our annual foundation gala. As I looked out at the hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by Frank's generosity, I thought about the woman who had whispered, "Finally, it's all mine," at his funeral. Carol had been right. In a way, Frank's death had given her something that was all hers. But it wasn't money or property. It was the chance to discover who she really was beneath the entitlement and manipulation. It was the opportunity to build a life based on her own efforts and contributions. It was the gift of self-respect and genuine relationships. Frank's true legacy wasn't the restaurants or the foundation or even the millions of dollars he'd accumulated. His legacy was the lesson he'd taught all of us about the difference between what we want and what we need, between what we're given and what we earn, and between love that enables and love that empowers. That second will hadn't just redistributed Frank's wealth, it had redistributed his values, ensuring that his death would be not just an ending, but a beginning for everyone who'd been touched by his generosity and wisdom. And in the end, that proved to be worth far more than money ever could be.